I used to think retirement would bring peace. No more cases keeping me up at night. No more hunting down leads until the lines between right and wrong blurred. After 2 decades as a detective, I thought stepping away from the job would mean stepping into a quieter life. For a while, it did. Sarah and I had been together long enough that we didn't need to talk much anymore. Most nights, she'd come home late, drop her things by the door, and we'd exchange a few words over dinner. It was comfortable, predictable, but as the weeks went by, I noticed the silence between us wasn't just from exhaustion. There was something else, something unsaid growing in the space between us. It was in the little things, the way her phone was always face down on the table, the new passwords on her laptop, the way she'd go quiet when I walked into the room. I told myself I was imagining it. Old habits, I figured. Once a detective, always a detective. But no matter how much I tried to shake it off, the feeling stuck. A gut instinct I couldn't ignore. Tonight was no different. I sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the fridge filling the silence, as I watched Sarah move around the room. She was in her usual routine, cooking dinner with her back turned to me. The way she moved, so precise, so focused, it felt distant, mechanical, like she was playing a role. "You've been working late a lot," I said, keeping my tone casual. She didn't turn around. "Yeah, things are busy at the office. That merger's still giving you trouble?" "Mm-hmm," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the chopping board. No further explanation. I nodded, letting the subject drop. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. I took a sip of my beer, trying to ignore the tension in the room, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that there was something just out of reach, something she wasn't telling me. I'd spent years reading people, understanding their tells, picking up on the subtle shifts in behavior. Sarah had always been hard to read. Even when we first met, she had this way of keeping her cards close to her chest, never letting anyone get too close. But now, after everything we'd been through, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd missed something, if I'd been blind to something right in front of me. After dinner, Sarah disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I cleaned up, the rhythmic sound of running water doing little to calm my nerves. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that Sarah's late nights and her distance were just stress from work. But deep down, I knew better. As I wiped down the counters, I noticed something strange. A drawer in the study that wasn't fully closed. It was barely noticeable, just a crack, but it caught my attention. Sarah never left things like that. She was meticulous, careful. It was one of the things I'd always admired about her. I glanced up the stairs, listening for any sign of her moving around, but the house was silent. My curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the drawer, hesitating for just a moment before pulling it open. Inside there were papers, ordinary looking at first glance. A few manila folders with business documents, but there, tucked beneath the folders, was something else. A sleek black phone, not her usual one, a burner. My stomach dropped. The phone looked brand new. No scratches, no scuffs. Just a single unread message blinking on the screen. The sender was anonymous. The number unfamiliar. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. I knew I shouldn't. I knew whatever I was about to see would change things, but I couldn't stop myself. I unlocked the phone. Tomorrow night, 9 p.m., same place. That was it. No name, no signature, just instructions, cold and simple. I stood there for a moment, the phone heavy in my hand, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it was nothing, a mistake. But the more I stared at that message, the more the familiar feeling of suspicion crept back in. I put the phone back, closing the drawer softly, carefully like it might bite me. The normalcy of our evening had evaporated, leaving behind a cold knot of doubt in my gut. Sarah was hiding something, and now I had the first piece of the puzzle. Upstairs, the bedroom light was off when I entered. Sarah was already in bed, her back turned to me, her breathing slow and even. I stood by the doorway for a long moment, watching her silhouette in the darkness, the soft rise and fall of her chest. I wondered what she was dreaming about. Was she thinking about me, about us? Or was she thinking about whatever meeting was planned for tomorrow at 9 p.m.? And more importantly, who was she meeting? I lay down next to her, the bed feeling too large, too cold. My mind wouldn't stop racing. The burner phone, the message. It was all too familiar, too calculated. I had seen this before during my years on the force. People didn't use burner phones for casual conversations. They used them when they didn't want to be traced. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I didn't know about Sarah's life outside these walls. The long hours at the office, the unexplained absences. How had I ignored it for so long? I stared at the ceiling, sleep refusing to come. There was only one thing I knew for sure. I couldn't confront her. Not yet. Not until I had more. If I pushed too soon, she'd lock me out completely. No, I had to do this carefully. I had to get the truth without tipping her off. Tomorrow night at 9 p.m. I'd follow her, and this time, I'd get answers. The next morning, Sarah was already gone by the time I woke up. The note she left on the counter was short, polite, almost routine. Meetings all day. I'll be home late. Don't wait up. I stared at it for a long time, wondering how long she'd been leaving me notes like this. Notes I didn't question because I never had a reason to. But now everything felt different. Every word she wrote felt like another layer of the wall she'd built between us, and I'd spent too many years ignoring the cracks. I couldn't ignore them anymore. I sat in my car later that evening, parked around the corner from our house, just out of sight. I'd planned everything carefully. I'd spent the day doing what I knew best, digging. I contacted a couple of old friends, guys from the force who owed me a few favors. It wasn't hard to get the number on that burner phone traced. I didn't expect to find much, but I got a location. A warehouse tucked away in a part of town people forgot about. The kind of place where nothing good had ever happened. 9 p.m., same place. The words from the message echoed in my head as I waited. I checked my watch. 8:30 p.m. The house was dark, but I knew Sarah was inside, getting ready for wherever she was headed. I wondered if she'd feel me watching her, if she sensed that I wasn't the same man who trusted her blindly last week. Old habits die hard. And tonight, I was stepping back into a role I thought I'd left behind, not as her husband, but as a detective. At exactly 8:45 p.m., the front door opened. I sank deeper into my seat as Sarah walked out, glancing briefly down the street before heading to her car. Her movements were smooth, practiced. She was hiding something, and it showed. I waited until she pulled out of the driveway before following, keeping my distance. We wound through the city, heading farther from the business district and into the industrial zone. The streets became darker, quieter, the streetlights fewer and farther between. I wasn't surprised when she took a sharp left into an abandoned parking lot near the warehouse district. I'd been expecting it. Sarah parked her car behind a row of rusted shipping containers, the kind you could hide anything in and no one would ever find it. I stayed back, killing my engine as she stepped out, pulling her jacket tight against the wind. She glanced around, clearly making sure no one had followed her, but she never looked in my direction. She disappeared into the shadows of the warehouse. I waited for a moment, giving her enough time to get inside before I got out of my car and made my way toward the building. The warehouse was old, the kind of place where the city had forgotten to care. Its windows were broken, metal beams rusted with age. It smelled of oil and dust, thick in the air as I crept toward the side entrance. Inside, it was quiet, too quiet. I slipped between the shadows, staying close to the walls, listening for any sign of Sarah. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct on high alert. I followed the faint murmur of voices until I saw her. Sarah stood in the center of the warehouse, facing two men I didn't recognize. One of them was tall, lean, with a scar running down the side of his face. The other was shorter, stockier, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. They looked like trouble, the kind of men you'd never see at her corporate office. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but it didn't take long to piece it together. "Everything's in place," Sarah said, her voice steady, confident. The tall man nodded, but his expression was hard. "We don't want any surprises." "There won't be. He doesn't know anything." Sarah's words cut through me, sharp as a blade. "Hey, they were talking about me." "Good, for your sake. Let's hope that stays true." I stepped back, my heart racing. Whatever Sarah was mixed up in, it wasn't just an affair. This was something else, something dangerous. I couldn't stay any longer. I needed to get out before they saw me. My mind was spinning as I retraced my steps out of the warehouse, slipping back into the darkness of the parking lot. My thoughts raced as I made my way to my car, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. She was lying to me. Of course she was. But the scope of her lies was bigger than I had imagined. Sarah wasn't just meeting someone behind my back. She was working with people I'd spent my entire career chasing. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to calm the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The pieces were starting to come together, but they weren't making sense yet. I needed more. More than a burner phone, more than a warehouse meeting. I needed hard evidence. When I pulled into the driveway, the house felt colder than usual, empty. The kind of emptiness that creeps into every room, into every corner, and makes you question everything. I waited for Sarah to come home, sitting in the living room, my phone buzzing in my hand as I stared at the clock. The minutes dragged on, each one slower than the last. It was after midnight when I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. She came inside quietly, like she was trying not to wake me. When she saw me sitting on the couch, her smile was quick, rehearsed. "Hey, you're up late." I forced a smile. couldn't sleep. Long night? Something like that. She didn't linger, didn't ask for details, just kissed me on the cheek and went upstairs, leaving me in the dark with my thoughts. It was like she knew, like she was waiting for me to catch her, but still confident she could talk her way out of it when I did. I stared at the staircase, her footsteps fading as she reached the bedroom. My mind was spinning, but there was no turning back now. I had to know how deep this went, and I knew exactly who to call for help. The next morning, I called Greg. He had been my partner for years back when I was still on the force. If there was anyone I could trust to help me with this, it was him. I wasn't planning on giving him the full story, just enough to make sure he understood the stakes. "Mark, what's going on?" Greg's voice was gruff, the same no-nonsense tone he'd used back when we used to interrogate suspects. "I need a favor," I said, pacing the length of my living room. "And I need you to keep this between us." There was a pause. Greg knew me well enough to know I wasn't the type to ask for help unless I was in deep. "All right, what do you need?" "I need you to run a background check on some people, quietly. I've got a couple of names, and I want to know who they're tied to, and I need it fast." Another pause. "Are you in trouble?" "I don't know yet, but I'll be if I don't figure this out." Greg sighed. "Send me the names." I rattled off the few details I had about the men Sarah had met at the warehouse, feeling the weight of every word. I hadn't told Greg the most important part, that Sarah was involved. I didn't want to admit it. Not yet. Not until I had all the pieces. The next few days were hell. Sarah acted like nothing had changed. Her routine was the same, her tone just as calm and collected as always, but I could feel the distance growing between us. Every word she said felt rehearsed, calculated, like she was playing a part she had practiced for years. I kept my distance too. The nights I spent sitting in front of the TV, pretending to watch, were really nights spent listening to her phone calls, trying to piece together more clues. But she was too careful, too controlled. The Sarah I thought I knew was slipping further away, and I was left grasping at the shadows she left behind. 3 days after I called Greg, he called me back. "Mark, we need to talk. In person." His tone sent a chill down my spine. I knew Greg well enough to know that whatever he found, it wasn't good. We met in a small diner on the outskirts of the city, far enough from anyone who might recognize me. Greg sat at a booth in the back, his usual cup of black coffee sitting untouched in front of him. When I slid into the seat across from him, he didn't waste any time. "The names you gave me, they're connected to the Moretti syndicate." I felt my stomach drop. "Moretti? As in Dominic Moretti?" Greg nodded, his eyes hard. "Yeah, the big guy himself. Your people, they're working for him. And from what I've found, it looks like they're planning something big." Moretti. Just hearing the name made my blood run cold. I had dealt with his organization before, back when I was still on the force. They were untouchable. Every case we built against them fell apart because they had half the city in their pockets. Judges, cops, politicians, you name it, Moretti had them on his payroll. "What kind of operation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Greg shrugged. "Could be anything. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. Moretti's into all of it. Whatever they're planning, it's big." I leaned back in my seat, my mind racing. Moretti was dangerous, one of the most powerful crime lords in the city. If Sarah was mixed up with him, then this was bigger than I could have ever imagined. "You want to tell me what's really going on, Mark?" Greg asked, his eyes narrowing. "Because I have a feeling you're not telling me the whole story." I stared at my coffee, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to process what he'd just told me. Moretti, how could Sarah be involved with someone like that? How could she have hidden something so huge from me for so long? "It's personal," I said, my voice low. "Someone close to me is involved. I just need to know how deep it goes." Greg studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Be careful, Mark. You don't want to get mixed up in this. If Moretti's involved, you're playing with fire." I drove home in a daze, Greg's words echoing in my head. Moretti. Sarah was working with one of the most dangerous men in the city. And for what? What could she possibly gain from getting involved with someone like that? When I got home, the house was dark. Sarah wasn't back yet. And for once I was glad. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. I couldn't confront her. Not yet. Not until I had all the facts. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was bigger than me. This wasn't just about Sarah and me anymore. This was about Moretti and the people he was using to run his empire. And if Sarah was one of them, then I couldn't just sit by and do nothing. I grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet and poured myself a drink, sinking into the couch as I tried to make sense of everything. My mind raced with questions. Who were those men at the warehouse? What was Sarah's role in all of this? And most importantly, how had I missed it? I took a long sip of whiskey, feeling the burn as it slid down my throat. I had spent years solving other people's problems, hunting down criminals and putting them behind bars. But now, I couldn't even figure out what was happening in my own home. The burner phone, the meeting, Moretti. It all pointed to one thing. Sarah was in deeper than I had ever imagined. And if I didn't figure out how to stop her, she was going to drag me down with her. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Sarah, listening to the sound of her breathing, wondering how long she had been keeping these secrets from me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Moretti's face, heard the rumors about the people who crossed him, and I couldn't help but wonder, was Sarah next, or was I? The next day, I made a decision. I couldn't keep playing this game, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I had to confront Sarah, had to get the truth out of her once and for all. I didn't care if it blew up in my face. I needed answers. When she came home that evening, I was waiting for her in the kitchen, the burner phone on the table in front of me. She froze when she saw it, her eyes flicking from the phone to me. For a moment, I saw something flash across her face. Fear maybe, or guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Mark," she said, her voice steady. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. I just stared at her, waiting for her to speak. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You've been following me, haven't you?" "You didn't leave me much of a choice," I said, my voice cold. "What the hell is going on, Sarah? Who are those men you're meeting with?" She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "You shouldn't have done that." "I shouldn't have done that." I stood up, my anger boiling over. "You're the one sneaking around with the burner phone, meeting with criminals. You're working with Moretti, Sarah. Do you have any idea what kind of man he is?" She didn't flinch, didn't back down. If anything, she looked calmer than ever. "I know exactly who he is." Her words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. You've been working with him?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth hit me like a freight train. Sarah wasn't just involved with Moretti. She was part of his organization. She had been working for him the whole time, right under my nose. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked away, her jaw tight. "Years." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about Sarah, about our life together, it was all a lie. She had been playing me from the start. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why would you do this?" She turned back to me, her eyes cold and unreadable. "Because I had to." That was it. No explanation, no apology, just those 4 words. I stared at her, feeling the anger and betrayal boiling up inside me. "You had to? You had to betray me, to work for a man like Moretti?" Sarah didn't answer. She just stood there, her face expressionless, like she was waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't sleep that night. After our confrontation, Sarah had gone upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the burner phone, replaying every moment of our relationship in my head. Every smile, every kiss, every lie. I should have seen it sooner. I should have known, but it was too late. Sarah had made her choice. She had chosen Moretti, chosen to betray me, and now I had to decide what to do next. The old detective in me wanted to take her down, to go to the cops, to expose her and Moretti, and everyone else involved, but I knew that wouldn't work. Moretti had too much power, too many people in his pocket. If I went after him, I'd be the one who ended up dead. Or worse. No, I couldn't go to the cops. But I couldn't just let her walk away either. I couldn't let her get away with this. I had to confront Moretti myself. By the next morning, I had made my decision. There was no turning back. Moretti had to know that I was onto him. And Sarah had crossed a line that I couldn't forgive. I wasn't going to go to the cops, but I wasn't going to sit back and wait for Moretti's men to take me out either. I had to end this on my terms. I had one advantage. Moretti didn't know I was coming. As far as he knew, I was still in the dark about Sarah's involvement. I had to use that. I texted Greg, telling him to stay out of it. He'd done enough for me already, and I didn't want to pull him deeper into this mess. This was my fight, and I didn't need any more blood on my hands. After sending the message, I got into my car and drove straight to the warehouse. The same one where Sarah had met those men, the heart of Moretti's operation, hidden in plain sight in the industrial part of the city. The warehouse loomed in front of me, silent and imposing. The air was heavy with tension as I stepped out of the car and approached the side entrance. My mind was racing, but my instincts were sharp. I wasn't walking into this blind. Inside, the warehouse was eerily quiet. I moved quickly, slipping between the shadows, making my way toward the back office where I knew Moretti conducted his business. I could hear voices, low, murmured conversations, coming from the other side of the door. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was it, the moment I had been dreading, the moment I had been preparing for. I had no idea what was waiting for me behind that door, but I knew one thing. I wasn't walking away until I got answers. I pushed the door open. Moretti sat behind a large wooden desk, his dark eyes lifting to meet mine as I entered. He didn't look surprised. He barely even moved, just leaned back in his chair, a small amused smile curling at the edges of his lips. "I've been expecting you," he said calmly, his voice smooth as silk. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Where's Sarah?" Moretti raised an eyebrow, clearly entertained by my directness. "She's safe, for now." I clenched my fists, my body tensing. "What do you want from me?" Moretti leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. "What I want, Mark, is for you to stay out of my business. You've been digging where you shouldn't be, and that's a dangerous habit. You've already got Sarah. Why drag me into this?" "Sarah made her choices," Moretti said, his tone matter of fact. "She knew what she was getting into, but you're a wild card, a liability. You see, I don't like loose ends." I could feel the noose tightening around me. Moretti wasn't just threatening me, he was laying out the terms. He didn't want me dead, at least not yet. He wanted me controlled. "You think I'm just going to walk away, forget everything I know?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Moretti's smile widened. "That's exactly what I expect. You stay quiet. I let you live. Simple, isn't it?" The audacity of it, the calm, calculating way Moretti dismissed me, stoked the fire inside me. He thought he'd won, that I was too weak, too scared to fight back. But what he didn't know was that I had nothing left to lose. "You're wrong," I said, taking a step closer to his desk. "You don't know me. I'm not afraid of you, Moretti. And I sure as hell won't let you get away with this." His eyes darkened, and I could see the shift in his demeanor, amusement turning to cold calculation. Moretti wasn't used to being challenged, and I could tell I'd crossed a line. "I could kill you right now," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I have men outside who would make you disappear, and no one would ever know." "Do it," I dared him, stepping closer. "But you know as well as I do that if I disappear, it won't be clean. Greg's a detective, and he's already involved. There are people who will start asking questions, and you won't be able to bury them all." For the first time, I saw hesitation flicker in Moretti's eyes. He was weighing his options, calculating the risk. But I didn't give him time to make a decision. I pulled out my gun, leveling it at him across the desk. Moretti's eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't flinch. He just stared at me, sizing me up. "You've got one chance," I said, my voice steady. "I walk out of here, and you stay out of my life. You leave Sarah alone, and you make sure no one comes after me." Moretti didn't move, didn't speak. He was thinking, calculating, but I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't used to losing, and he wasn't about to start now. But before either of us could make a move, the door behind me swung open. Sarah stood in the doorway, her eyes locked on mine. She looked different, paler, her usual composure shaken. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" I didn't lower my gun. What I should have done a long time ago. Sarah took a step forward, her eyes pleading. "Please, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." I cut her off, my voice cold. "You lied to me. You betrayed me. And now you expect me to just walk away?" She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't want this. I never wanted any of this." "Then why?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why did you do it, Sarah? Why did you get involved with him?" She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, her shoulders slumped, defeated. Defeated, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Because I didn't have a choice." The truth hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, I saw it. Real fear in Sarah's eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of Moretti. Fear of what he could do. I glanced at Moretti, who was watching the scene unfold with a cold, detached interest. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The power dynamic was clear. Sarah was just another pawn in his game. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. Sarah hadn't chosen this. She'd been forced into it. Moretti had his hooks in her long before I ever realized, and by the time I found out, it was too late. I lowered my gun, my heart pounding in my chest. I had been so blinded by my own anger, by my own sense of betrayal, that I hadn't seen the real danger. Sarah wasn't the enemy. Moretti was. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Mark." I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy fog. I know. There was no gunfight, no dramatic showdown. Moretti knew when he'd lost control of the situation, and for the first time in his life, he was outplayed. I had leverage, and he couldn't afford to have this blow up in his face. I took Sarah's hand and we walked out of that warehouse together, leaving Moretti behind. I didn't look back. There was no point. Back at home, the reality of everything finally settled in. Sarah and I had lost something irreparable, something that might never be fixed. The trust between us was gone, shattered beyond repair, but there was still a chance. Maybe not for us to go back to the way things were, but for us to find a way forward. We sat in silence, side by side on the couch, the weight of everything we had been through hanging over us. It was a long road ahead, and there were no guarantees. But we had survived. For now, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Moretti's operation began to unravel. With the leverage I had, Greg and I worked behind the scenes to dismantle his network, piece by piece. Moretti went underground, his empire collapsing as his allies fled or turned on him. Sarah left the city shortly after that. We didn't say much when she left. There wasn't anything left to say. She needed a fresh start, far away from the life she'd been forced into. I didn't blame her. I just hoped she found peace, wherever she ended up. As for me, I stayed behind, watching the city go on as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I had seen the underbelly, and it had changed me. I was no longer the man I once was, but at least for the first time in a long time, I knew where I stood.